Okay. Dear students, it's a great honor to me to introduce to you my colleague from the United Kingdom. His name is Darren Lilleker. He is the professor of Center of, how do you call it?
Comparative Media and Politics Research.
Yeah, so it seems to me that his main expertise lies in the sphere of political communication, but maybe he will correct me in any way he wants, he deems necessary. Okay, so the floor is yours, dear Darren. Please start, and dear students, be ready to pose your questions and to react to the questions of the lecturer. Okay, go on.
Thank you, Maxim, and thank you everyone for joining me. I hope you're all safe and well. It must be a very difficult situation for you all. So, but you can join me at all is fantastic. So I agreed with Maxim. I would talk about news values. My research is more on party communication and on how citizens think about politics. But of course, what the media says is very, very important. And so how they prioritize news stories, how they decide what to put on front pages and feel that people know is really important. This will be based on studies of the British media, so I hope that is of interest. But I also use some references to how they have covered things like the invasion of Ukraine. So I hope that has some resonance as I go through. So just to set a definition for you, so news values is, well, they are the criteria that influence selection and presentation of events and published news. So basically it is the decisions made by the editors of newspapers or editors working within the television channels to decide what it is that they put at the top of the news. And so if you look at things like the BBC website or any similar website, you will see a list of stories from top to bottom, and that suggests the order of priority that they have for those news items. And they often, and I'll show you how this looks in reality from yesterday's news, they often have very different priorities and different perspectives of who their audience is, what their audience want to know about. And just sort of historically, the Daily Mail may not be a newspaper you're familiar with. It's one of the most read newspapers in the UK. It was founded over 100 years ago by a man called Lord Northcliffe. In fact, he was given the title of Lord for his services to journalism. And his philosophy for selling newspapers in 1896 onwards was to have the most shocking stories on the front page. And so it was very much a London-based newspaper when it first started. London was a city with large amounts of crime. So the idea of get me a murder a day, but make it the most shocking murders, make it the most gruesome details. Because if he had that on the front cover and then inside in the pages, more detail, he could look at that and see the sales go up. The philosophy hasn't changed a huge amount, but the way that news is consumed has changed very dramatically. Paul Dacre, apologies for the cat. Paul Dacre, who is the current editor of the Daily Mail, is now much more interested in what he can see online. So though the priorities, they still have a paper copy, you could still buy that paper copy, most news is now shared online. So it's much more about getting clicks. And he sees as being a major news story one that can get close to having 1 million clicks, 1 million people reading that story. And that not only helps the newspaper know what to produce and how to put together stories. But also it helps their advertising revenue because sales of newspapers are declining, but the use of them online is increasing at the same time. So the advertising revenue they receive from each click to a page and the advertising that's shown on that page earns them revenue to keep them in business. So the principles haven't changed a huge amount over the last 125 years, but just the way that we consume news has. But still over that period, and this goes for almost all broadcasters and newspapers and even the online news providers, they will prioritize stories that they feel will have appeal to their audience, or they try to frame stories to give them appeal. I'll talk more about that in a moment. So just to give a sense of the media environment, this is very much the case of the UK, but I don't think it's particular to the UK. It's very much true of America and most countries where there are competing news outlets. So television channels have to justify their existence, mostly to their advertisers, and they're very reliant on advertisers. So the more viewers they can claim to have, the more attractive they are to advertisers, and so they will get that funding through to produce the news. And of course, if they don't produce news that people watch, advertisers won't buy those slots in the middle of the news, and so they find that news programs are very much squeezed, as in there isn't enough interest. And really what we've seen in the UK is that news tends to be either on specialist channels, BBC News, Sky News channels, Bloomberg, etc., or it's only really covered by the BBC because the BBC is a state broadcaster and sees its role as pushing out information. But many other channels do not see anything beyond a short news program attractive to their audiences. State broadcasters, the BBC is quite a unique organization. It is organized and run by the state, and the state defines its rules. And this is the case for many, many state broadcasters. And so when they're deciding their priorities, they have to consider their role and relationship with the state. And the flexibility that a state broadcaster enjoys can vary very, very dramatically across the world. So there was that difference in terms of the priorities that a state broadcaster has compared to a commercial news outlet. Newspapers on the whole are mostly independent. Our newspapers definitely are all independent. And they're competing with one another for readers all the time, both readers of the print copy, but also readers of the online versions. And online news consumption and even production is very highly fragmented. There are lots and lots of different outlets which people go to, and what we've seen over the last really 20 years is people choosing where to get their news from at certain times. The first study that showed this in the UK was during the invasion of Iraq, where people were going to Al Jazeera, which is a Middle Eastern-based news outlet. They also had journalists within Iraq, but they gave a very different perspective. Sometimes the Al Jazeera journalists were based with the Iraqi forces, as opposed to the BBC, Sky, etc., being embedded with the US and UK forces. So a very different perspective of what was happening. They were able to talk to ordinary Iraqis and get a sense of how things were working out on the ground in Iraq. And so that shift informed people that there were different audiences who were seeking out news independently based on what they wanted to know about. So that really changed the way that many broadcasters looked at their audiences, and some diversified and had different areas with different journalists producing their own content, which would attract a small niche but quite important audience. Others try to, find things that their major audience would like. Very much we see a lot of news by social media. There's been a big shift towards people saying that they receive their news from social media. Now, social media, of course, don't produce any news, but what they do is they're a platform where news is shared. So often people learn about news from major broadcasters, newspapers, etc., but that is due to what their friends are sharing. And so it's no longer a case that people will simply go to a news site and read through it in order, but people receive that news in very, very different ways based on how it's being shared, and also how the algorithms of platforms like Twitter, Facebook, etc., will promote certain stories to people based on what they've clicked on before, because they want to have that they want users to have the experience of finding things that are interesting to them when they go onto their feeds. If a wonderful experiment I've done with a number of students also is the Google personalization of news. So if you were all to, and you can if you wish, go onto Google and type news and just see what comes up, you may well get a very different set of results individually. And if you and a friend next door to each other, if you both like the same things, then you may get exactly the same news feed. But if you were to do that with your parents, you may get very, very different results from Google News. So just one of those things that we don't normally see, or many people don't see news in the chronological order in the way that news outlets produce them. And of course, there is this huge competition for attention. All television stations, newspapers, and online outlets are trying to compete to get our attention with news stories. So what do we know about the audience? And of course, the audience matters hugely within all of this, because that's who the news outlets are competing for. So one thing that we find consistently is that audiences engage with stories that are relevant to them. Local news remains very important, even though local newspapers are in serious decline. But people want to know about things happening in their local area. They need information about that local area. And there are many, many providers of local news across many countries that people go into. They also want national news stories, though, that explain things for their personal circumstances. So last week, there was well, it wasn't called a budget, but basically it was a budget in the UK where the Chancellor announced his spending plans and taxation plans. And people wanted to know not about the general plans, because they're very often very complicated, very general. What they wanted was this breaking down. How does this affect someone like me? And news outlets increasingly try to provide that with a sense of who their audience is. So the way they frame the reporting of that will be dependent on who they think their audiences are, what they want to know. Also, there's a huge amount of research about the emotional resonance of a story, the things that shock people, surprise people, have an effect on them. So they can be things like scandals, which often have high engagement, particularly if the scandal is surprising. And often the most hits are had by celebrity news scandals. So, a celebrity couple divorcing, or celebrities having affairs with one another, and those kind of sort of sex scandals particularly are always things that get a lot of clicks. But also stories, so a lot of the personalization of news, and this has been something that has grown increasingly over perhaps 40 years, but getting more intense now, is that when any big events are reported, the human story within that, the story of one person and one family, can have much greater resonance than statistics. I think there was a quote about the fact that, sort of big numbers are just statistics, whereas one person is a human tragedy. And when we look at some of the reporting, the protests in Iraq, the invasion of Ukraine, the stories that are prioritized by news are often framed within the life of an individual. This is the effect on this person because we can relate to that person, as opposed to this is the problem that 100 people or 1,000 people are facing. People tend not to engage with those as much. So that sort of emotional resonance with an individual, whether it be a celebrity or whether it be an ordinary person, is key to getting that traction. So journalists are constantly looking for those sorts of things. Scandals and shocking events, obviously, ordinary people doing extraordinary things. There was a big event in the UK which raises money for charity, and so a lot of those cases of people who are walking extraordinary amounts of miles or being sponsored to do certain things, those things make news coverage. One of the problems, though, is to keep the audience's attention on things. Some colleagues of mine did a study in Nepal some years ago. There was an earthquake, and the international news media moved in and showed what was happening, showed the devastation of certain parts of Nepal, particularly rural areas. They actually got in the way of the Nepal authorities trying to, sort of sort things out and help people. And after about 3 or 4 days, all the news media moved out. And at the same time, the international attention waned. People were no longer willing to give money to help the people of Nepal. And so there is that fatigue that seems to set in with stories that either have no clear resolution or that, nothing changes. So often, an earthquake will happen, there is extreme devastation, loss of life, all of those sorts of issues. And people are shocked by it and will happily consume that news. And they may well give money to that, to the cause, or they may talk to their local MP and say, why aren't we helping more? So they'll put pressure on governments to help. But it's a very, very short window of attention. And the media moves on, but also so do the public. They don't want to see a long 10, 20-year process of rebuilding. And there's been a real worry about that among British journalists regarding the invasion of Ukraine, that the first shocking days and those initial events are ones which gather news attention. People want to hear about it. People are shocked by it. But as a conflict goes on and on, you have to find new ways of telling the story and making people believe it's important without losing their attention and having that fatigue of it's still going on, it's depressing, but I don't really want to hear about it anymore because I can't personally do anything. And it's not that audiences don't care, it is that sense of, well, what can I do about it? And they don't want to be depressed by news and feel powerless and scared by events. So that's where human interest stories, particularly as Russian troops have left, so media organizations going into those areas, talking to those people, but very much personalizing it. Here is one lady whose family, she has lost family members, or here is a lady who survived through this and how she has dealt with the problems. Those sorts of stories enable people to sort of keep attention and feel that there is something new happening. But many conflicts in the world get ignored by the media. There's an initial burst of attention, and then the cameras move back, and it's just going on, and nobody really knows much about it. So audiences are very complicated, and dealing with those is something that journalists from every media organization is facing, and trying to work out how to make sure that audiences know what's happening in the world and recognize the importance of certain issues, but also how to make them pay attention. Because if they don't engage with stories, then they're not going to be informed about them. So there's a challenge there with how to manage these complex audience members. And of course, there are some people who are highly interested who want lots of information, but the vast majority do not. So satisfying both is also problematic. So how do journalists think through this? Firstly, they do have a public service sense of what their audiences should know and need to know. Great example with the COVID-19 pandemic. Yeah, if we look back at that period, in particularly early 2020, every news outlet was focusing on what the current restrictions were, what we should do, how we protect ourselves, all of those issues. Yeah, and very much becoming really a part of the state's communication process. So you know, that's something that they all covered. But the rest of the time, they have to decide what is important, what do our audiences need to know, and what should they know. Some news outlets concentrate a huge amount on climate change and the environment. Some almost never mention it, and it's not front page news. So you know, that's a sense of not just what their audiences need to know, but what do they want to know. And they're also very keen when they're giving information to ensure that it has that relevance and it's given that sense of importance by what they do. There is the engagement, which I've talked about. One issue here is clickbait, and this is something that I'm sure you're all familiar with, even if you're not familiar with the term. But the idea of creating short headlines that grab people's attention. And many news organizations have been criticized for creating headlines which are clickbait, things that draw us in and make us click. There are a lot of outlets that work with social media that have false claims that you click and then you go through and it's an advertising website. And the problem is that some people see news as replicating that the headline is dramatic and attention grabbing, but the content isn't. And of course, when people find that, they don't then click again. They may not go to that news outlet, or they may be more cautious about clicking if they feel they're just being drawn in to see some advertising. So engagement is an issue, and people are not as dumb as often is believed, that they will be quite clever and think, no, that's not going to be something of interest. That's not going to reflect the headline. There's also issues about verifiability. Lots and lots of debates about what or how journalists can present a story when they can't get to all the facts. You know, so journalists struggle to find out exactly what is happening in the middle of a war zone, or in a country where things are, you know, news is restricted. So both Ukraine and Iran at the moment, two major news stories, but it's difficult to always verify things, because what the news doesn't want to do, particularly news outside of a particular country, it doesn't want to be providing basically a one-sided story based on one part of a conflict, whether it's the people against the state in Iran, or whether it's claims by Russia or Ukraine. So the BBC is very concerned particularly, and they've discussed it quite a bit, of how they look at a story and say, well, we need to verify exactly what's happening here. We don't want to publish a claim which then later is proven to be true, and we've been drawn in by the propaganda of one side or another, or the false claims of one side or another. And that happens in a whole range of contexts. Even during the invasion of the Capitol in the US and the those protests after Donald Trump lost the election, there were a number of stories circulating about what was happening behind the scenes, and was Trump trying to stop the National Guard from protecting the Capitol building, which journalists were trying to get verification for before they pushed them out. But of course, they have a problem there, because Twitter is already pushing those stories out, and people who maybe claim to be journalists will be pushing those stories out. So most of those quality broadcasts have that problem that facts or claims of fact are being released, and they can be very much behind that news and seem to be lagging and not the source of the story first. A colleague of mine who retired recently, Stephen Jukes, was head of news at Reuters, and he was in control of the newsroom in the morning of 9/11 when the planes struck the two towers in America. And he was removed from his job because he refused to call it a terrorist attack until he knew it was a terrorist attack. And they wanted to call it, and other news outlets were calling it. So that's the tensions that can happen in a newsroom. And finally, the editorial agenda. So mostly, state broadcasters often have an editorial agenda imposed upon them by the state, but not all of them. Some have a claim to public service broadcasting, so they will cover anything they think that's in the public interest. But others are quite ideological. The newspapers in the UK are ideologically led. The Daily Mail is quite right-wing and conservative, focuses on crime. It has quite an anti-immigration line, and loves stories on the front cover about crimes committed by immigrants. The Guardian, on the other hand, is very left-wing and globalist. That leads a great deal on climate change and what's not happening in the world. So sometimes they will choose certain things because of their own ideology. And knowing their ideology helps us understand why their news values and priorities are different. So why does this matter? Before we look at how it looks. So firstly, there is a theory of media effects. Some will claim very, very hard media effects, that media has a big effect on what we do and how we think. But agenda setting theory, which was developed in the early 1970s, suggests that basically media can't influence our thinking. It can't tell us how we should think about an event, but it does have the power to tell us what to think about. We don't know and can't know what's happening in the world. We can't know what's happening behind the scenes in politics. So if the media come together and tell us that something is happening and something is important, that's how we know about it. And also, in the same way, if something isn't covered in the media, we don't know about it unless we are really personally interested and want to go and find out more about that. And that's where those issues, for example, an earthquake in Nepal, we know it's happened, but we don't know what happens afterwards. And often people assume everything's fine because it's not on the news. That's also the danger that can happen with the situation in Iran, the situation that you are all facing, where if the media doesn't make it a priority, people say, oh, everything must be okay now. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to worry about it. It must be all right. There's also a problem with media reliance, and this is where the ideological slant of news is problematic, that if people tend to use one source of news only, then they could end up with a very narrow view of the world, which is also driven by their own particular ideology. Of course, where there are state broadcasters and state control, that's exactly what the state wants. We can think of China and Russia in those cases. But often people will choose the news that they like the most or they agree with the most, and so don't get a diverse range of views. And if that particular news outlet prioritizes certain types of story, they may have a very skewed view of the world. And inoculation is going into that fatigue thing where basically people lose empathy. They no longer have the will to focus on a story, and they become sort of desensitized to something. That's where human interest is really important. When it's reported that thousands of people are affected by something, it's very hard for any individual person to imagine that. Whereas if you can hear the words of a person, then you're more likely to engage and not be kind of inoculated against the worst parts of the story, if you like. But those kinds of stories that drag on with no clear resolution, people just become unable to engage with it and sort of disempowered from it because they can't do anything about it. So that's why people are concerned about the way that news values work. And often what research shows is that across a nation, we have access to sufficient information about everything that's happening if we choose to engage with it. But looking at individual news outlets, often there's a very narrow view. And that's where individual news values versus the more kind of global, what's happening in the major, across all of the news outlets matters. So just a little bit of sort of contextual research for the UK. Harkup and O'Neill did a piece of research which covered across a whole period of time, looking at what news values, what sort of topics were covered in the news. And so they had every news outlet that was recognized as a news outlet within the UK. So it didn't include online news outlets which just cover global news, or things like Breitbart in the US. It was only those based in the UK and registered as news outlets. But it gives a clear sense of the sorts of things that we're most likely to see in the news, and that give me a murder a day. The bad news is the priority. So that's the sort of thing we would see on the front page of newspapers most likely, and will be prioritized. And I'll show you how this looks in the news. Second is things that's surprising. Then there's sort of entertainment. So when I say about soft human interest stories, basically things that have no importance. So, is a celebrity getting married, Johnny Depp being in court, animals being saved from something, or sports stories. Obviously, there's interest in them, and a huge amount of interest in them, as we see by the frequency of shares, but they don't have any clear importance. So the sorts of things that news outlets produce because they get the clicks, that's where their money is. So it's a balancing act a lot of the time. But surprise and bad news is also shared quite a bit. One of the interesting things is the kind of the examining of the power elite, which is a major role of public service broadcasters, which our television channels tend to model themselves on. It's the fourth priority for across the news, and it would be higher for the TV broadcasters, but that's not something that gets shared. So it's important information, but people don't push it out. And so it's not likely to be the thing that the Twitter, Facebook algorithms will pick up and push out to other people. And then you have the sort of the hard human interest stories. And obviously there's the coding of these depends on the time. So, that the sort of what is a hard human interest stories? Well, it can be issues, so charities raising concerns within a sector in the UK. It can be about problems within education or health. There's a whole range of different things that can fall under that, depending on what the news is. Then there is the sort of global importance. one thing is that there's often quite clear in countries is that a lot of news is about the country itself. So if for example, a plane crashes, one of the numbers included within that will be how many people of a particular country where the news outlet is have been caught up in that. So there's a lot of global news, but actually made relevant to local audiences. But then there are some huge global importance issues. Donald Trump dominated UK news for his time as president in many ways. And it was often the sort of the magnitude and in terms of the importance, because he is the president, or was the president of America, but also the surprise because he's doing things that a president of America is not expected to do. So those kinds of things get wrapped up together. And then celebrities and good news, which is either it's the lowest priority, or there is that problem sometimes that good news does not sell newspapers, which Northcliffe would have said 125 years ago. But things like politics, it's very, very rare to have a good news story in politics. When we're examining the power elite, it's about holding them to account and exposing them and exposing problems they're causing. So there's certain things that don't feature too often, sadly. Just to give a sense of how decline, and so this is
Darren, can I interrupt you?
Of course.
Yeah. Can you return to the previous slide?
Yes.
What does it mean, frequency of shares on the social media? Does it mean that a bigger figure means more popular, more attention on social media, more value?
No, sorry. I should have said priority or rank in news shares. So it's
1 is the biggest, 8 is the lowest. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, it just gives that sense of the comparison between what the news outlets do and then what is shared, as best it can be, of course, calculated. But yeah, soft human interest stories, celebrity, well, not necessarily celebrity news, but sort of human interest stories around that are the things that people are most likely to share. Animal stories particularly. So this is just a very rough sketching of different news items over 2022, and with the trend line, which is, so this is a combination of the number of items of news and the prioritization of those items. Okay, so we had this at the beginning of the year, as you would expect, this huge amount of attention placed on what was happening in Ukraine, and Russia's invasion, its progress, its halting, its reversal. And that then sort of declined in terms of the priority given. Now, some of that is due to what was happening in the country. So Boris Johnson, being basically sacked as prime minister or leader of the party, the leadership election, the ensuing chaos, and of course the death of the Queen, which basically led to a news blackout for a week. So those things are kind of expected, but also they're unusual in that respect. We don't normally have 3 prime ministers in a year and the monarch dying. But still that line goes down, and as you'll see when I look at the news items from yesterday, certain news items covered certain stories, others did not in the same way. But it suggests that, and this has been said by a couple of journalists, that we haven't got anything new to say. And so what we don't want to do is just churn out the same kind of news that we had the previous day about Ukraine. What we need to do is have something new, because if not, the audience will become sort of inoculated against it, disengaged from it, they'll become apathetic. So that they have to think about the dramatic side, engage people because it's dramatic, but when things are no longer dramatic for a global audience, they have to find those stories that give it greater relevance and greater importance. So just that sense of, how the UK news handles those sorts of things, rightly or wrongly, it's a different question. So yesterday, I had the wonderful job of just looking through the different news channels and then the newspapers. So one of the things that the news, the lunchtime news had the advantage of over the newspapers is that they could cover the COP27 outcomes and the deal. So this is an ever-changing set of priorities as news comes into them. So with the BBC, that was the #1 news. They're a public service broadcaster. They're also linked into the British state, so this is something that's important. They're also reporting what a member of the government said on their own television program that goes out at 9 o'clock on a Sunday morning. So they always report on that on a Sunday. But then the third place is the statements about the mayor of Mariupol, we will rebuild. So that's the international importance and a different story, because it's looking behind the scenes, if you like, of where the Russians have been, but also that kind of bravery, human interest, strength in the face of what's happening. So the mayor of Mariupol, given this kind of quite good publicity for what he's saying. World Cup, obviously, big news, opening ceremony. Then you have the bad news, a shooting in the US. Trump allowed back to Twitter. That was sort of phrased as very much both surprising and but also, one of those sort of global but human interest stories to some extent. Then 3 more British politics things. In a way, I mean, the King Charles bit, not really politics, but one of his charities has been investigated. And then the 2 sort of bad news, one global, Turkish air raids on Kurdish bases and a teenager stabbed in the UK. So it gives an interesting look at how the public service broadcast of the BBC, this is what it's pushing out to the UK audience. What you will see of the BBC is going to be different, because they're going to be the BBC World News has a much different focus. But that's the news that it's pushing out to the UK population. What's interesting is not so much what they choose, but the differences. So ITV is independent television. It's a commercial outlet. And so has very different priorities. It has no links to the state. It has the COP27, but the World Cup is given a much bigger priority. So are some of the bad news stories, but a lot more local things before we get to the bottom around the controversies around the World Cup and the World Cup fan village, but very much more human interest, bad news, but much more also UK news, with I think Trump almost thrown a little bit as a celebrity being returned to Twitter because he's interesting to some people, as well as comedians protesting against the Qatar World Cup and the conditions in Qatar. Yeah, so just very, very different way of looking at the news and deciding which of the stories they're going to put on their front page. And Sky also different. I mean, Sky is a much more global broadcaster, though this is its UK page, but a very different order of things. So COP drops down in order of magnitude. Sorry, the numbers have gone a little bit awry there, but they're much more focused on the dangers of shelling nuclear plants, and so they prioritize a slightly different approach to looking at Ukraine. They haven't got the mayor of Mariupol. They haven't got that. They've got a much more important but very bad news story at the beginning of that. Then they have the shoot in the World Cup. Again, those kinds of entertainment, but also sort of bad news stories, celebrities with the comedian, local bad news in terms of the stabbing of a teenager. The only outlet to cover the first COVID death in China for 6 months, which it kind of surprised me. This was news in a way, but you know, Sky covering that. You know, why exactly it picked up on that? Maybe it was an exclusive, but you know, those sort of things are interesting. And also the Harvey Weinstein trial. So a lot of the same things appear at different, you know, in different places on the board, some different ones. But Sky perhaps looking at this, firstly, because Sky pushes out the same kind of news across the world, it is a little bit perhaps more global. Some things are going to be UK only, and that's fine, you know, because they do have their sort of UK outlet, but also a lot more of the sort of the entertainment, the bad news, which seem to be priorities for the people. And they don't do much examining elites, which may be related to the fact that people don't share it. It's hard to say that these things do correlate, but less of that compared to the BBC. So the BBC fulfilling its public service function as opposed to focusing on what's being shared, but its funding model is very different, so it can do that. And then, with apologies for a collage of newspapers, it just gives that sense of the different ways in which newspapers look at their audiences. So the World Cup, a big thing, both in terms of supporting the British team. So when it has the "Come on, you Lions," for some, the symbol of Britain, the 3 lions, it's there, and you have an old footballer saying your country needs you. You have the reporting about the FIFA president, but then the 4 top newspapers, the Mail, the more conservative right wing, is focusing on really what is examining the elites. This is what this is a proposal for reducing waste in the health service by cutting down on administrators. The Sunday Times, you know, there's kind of these 3 different stories, one about the King Charles charity issue, one about relations with the European Union, but also having the World Cup. So it's kind of thinking about what people are going to be seeing when they see the front cover. And of course, you have that little bit of, you know, sort of sport, free pull out, and human interest, Michelle Obama on the front. Sunday Telegraph, more right wing, conservative supporting, but you know, still 3 different types of story. And it has our Prime Minister on the cover and on his first visit to Kyiv. So I mean, that's the only picture of that on the front cover, which was interesting in its own way. And then the Observer, and the Observer is the Sunday's version of the Guardian, so quite a left-wing paper. So it's giving the Labour Party, the opposition party, the front page, but has Adele as opposed to you know, a more sort of, you know, harder story. Doesn't talk about COP27 on the front cover. And if you're interested about the Sun, so we have a program in the UK called "I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here," where a bunch of celebrities of dubious ranking are sent to jungle clearing Australia and put through a load of tasks. Boy George is a pop star from the 1980s, who is, yeah, front page news for whatever reason. But yeah, interesting, those sort of lower down, the tabloids are lower price, see their audiences as not particularly interested in hard politics and things like that. And so, you know, they're focusing on the World Cup, they're focusing on celebrity news to a greater extent. And the cat's back. So UK news now is just a very sort of brief summary. She hates shut doors. I do apologize, but let's sort of shut the door when I'm in here, and then she creates outside. But she also likes to sit on keyboards. So UK news values. So COP27, a major update which happened during the day, so the newspapers couldn't pick up on it. I am surprised The Guardian, because of its left-wing but also environmentalist position in The Observer, didn't talk about the problems with reaching a deal on the front cover. But perhaps because it didn't have anything really to say, it pushed it further into the newspaper. BBC and I guess the quality newspapers, so those four at the top, examining the elite and sort of focusing on hard news, but always have those things that draw in the audience that aren't really into the examining elites and hard news. Pullouts about the World Cup, for example. And entertainment, you know, a major, you know, part of what they do. You know, that entertainment news is entertaining, and so they push more of that out. And very different priorities for world news, apart from Trump being allowed to reopen his Twitter account. And that kind of, I think, dominance is perhaps not the right word, but bad news is clearly something that they push more on commercial television. And they often use the sort of headlines, you know, shot as teenager stabbed, and they don't give any more context in the headline. So you have to click on it and go into that other page of their site, which allows them to gather data on you, but also push advertising towards you. You know, so that's one of the ways that they work within those sites to kind of draw people into their site more. And of course, that's the sort of thing that is they'll likely push out on social media, which people can click on and go, oh my God, what's happened? And want to click on it and find out. And so just some further reading. There's a great book on news values, a little bit dated, you know, so it probably doesn't feature a great deal about Twitter and social media, but the principles from within the newsroom are the same. And then there's a link to the Harkup O'Neill. If anyone does want these, I can definitely supply all of the articles. I haven't got an electronic copy of the book. You know, a little bit of work I did, which is also sort of linking into what journalists should do and how they can provide news, but also to not frame news as being dramatic and full of scandal. Just as an aside, one of the criticisms of journalism around politics has been that they focus so much on scandal and bad news that people build this negative impression of politicians. Now, that's not always unfair, but you know, how to sort of, you know, not make people mistrusting of a situation, how to make people not feel, because they're reading bad news all the time, that the country is, you know, full of crime, you know, those kinds of things. And also how they frame international stories, you know, what can people do? But there's some asides around that for those interested. So I'm very happy to take questions. I don't know how that will work with everybody, but yes.
Oh, thank you so much, Darren. It is really wonderful and packed with information. Let's pose some question to the lecturer. Okay, guys, you may just write it down. You may just write it down in Ukrainian, and I will try to translate it to the lecturer. But okay, have your say. I will resort to Ukraine to Ukrainian to help them. Okay, друзі, є час поставити запитання. Будь ласка, хто бажає, то можна це робити.
Там перше питання в чаті є.
Ага. There is a thank you so much. There is a question in the chat box. Have you ever done investigative journalism that involved politics?
Not personally. I have never worked as a journalist. My colleague, Stephen Jukes, a former colleague, did quite a lot. But no, I've never personally worked as a journalist or in politics.
Okay, thank you. But I have one technical question. Why is the first line was not numbered in one of the ratings that you provided?
User error.
I believe it's a mistake.
Yeah, it was an error. When I formatted the table, I left the numbers in, and Sky had one extra, and so I copied. I was doing copying some of the headlines across and putting them in an order, and I inserted a line in the table, and I forgot then to move the numbers up. So I apologize for that. It was it was trying to get everything done before the news changed. So I took half an hour to put all those tables together quickly. So it was a snapshot of the 3 newsrooms at a time. So, if I'd left it for half an hour, something dramatic could have happened. It wouldn't have then showed the difference. So, one of those, there's always something I find on a PowerPoint slide that is not quite as it should be but only notice it when I'm reading it back and presenting it.
Yeah. Don't mention. Okay. Any more questions and feedback?
Yes.
Yeah.
Professor Lilleker, how do you think this struggle of newsrooms for audience attention leads to and research of a new form of news will lead to evolution of newsrooms, or it leads to forgetting of sense and Максиме Анатолійовичу, допоможіть сфокусувати увагу. And focus on form.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
What was the very last option? Sorry, I had.
So is it for this tendency is for
it good
better
or
or
bad?
for worse?
That is a very, very good question. Because what you don't want is a media that is purely led by the interests of the audience. Because what you would end up with is a very kind of tabloid, celebrity-led news. Now, there is a place for those outlets, and some countries have a newspaper or magazine that just does, and there are lots of them, that just do celebrity gossip and news. But if the newsroom, where they are dealing with international politics and domestic politics and society and all of those issues, start to prioritize those, it would be a bad thing, because we would be, as citizens, locked in this little bubble of only knowing about celebrity. And there is a real danger that some people are. So when we ask in surveys, or rather when the big survey companies like Pew Research ask about people's media habits, they will often say to them, where do you get your news? And they'll say social media, but they then don't ask them how well informed they are about politics or society. It's just a simple, where do you get it from? Then the platforms they use most, which is very frustrating. So journalists on the whole, and some of my colleagues are doing a project on journalistic values, looking in a range of countries. Journalists do their best, but they also know the editors and the owners of the newspapers you know, they need the money coming in, and the journalists also recognize that they need that money coming in so they get paid. That's one of the big problems with local news, that often local newspapers are closed down because there is no revenue coming in. So it's a delicate tension, which particularly those news outlets that say they have a public service role, so they're informing as well as entertaining. It's a delicate balance, and I think on the whole, many good outlets do that, and that is how that's the suggestion, not only in the UK but also Germany, France, and many other countries. There's a balance being struck. We'll never manage to reach everybody, but we do our best to reach as many as possible and inform as many as possible. But for those outlets that just follow clicks, it's a bigger problem. And I suppose looking forward, the question will be who has the most, who is given the most attention. Is it the people who are just churning out news about celebrities, or is it those with quality information and verified news? And yeah, that's an unknown. And we haven't even got into the field of disinformation and fake news and errors and things like that, you know, which is also behind the scenes in this in a way, because if you are just looking for clicks, a dramatic story about a celebrity, whether it's true or false, doesn't matter, you know, and that's where the online news outlets that have no real journalistic codes or ethics and often no regulators will push things out.
If I understand you correctly, you want to say that if media share important news in a new form, it's do better. Or if they not follow what want to be clickbait, only clickbait, it's bad. Yeah.
Sort of. And they have to be a little bit measured with the clickbait. You can turn an important news story into clickbait, but you need to do it sensibly, not just with a dramatic headline. But yeah, it's a balance they have to strike between getting people to engage and read something, but also to do it in a way that appeals to the audience.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you. Darren, is there anything that really needs to be improved or even rescued? Do you see any weakest points in the system? Because we all know that the UK has one of the strongest journalistic schools and markets in the world. So, okay. So, of course, it sets the level and measure for dozens of countries, okay, and even regions. But when speaking only about the UK media system, maybe journalist values, financing media, audiences, governments, anything else, or we have the biggest, the best media system that we deserve. What do you think that you deserve?
I mean, I think often we do have the media system we deserve. I suppose two things that are concerning about UK news, and this really relates to newspapers as opposed to the television news, which is very good, and there are other TV news channels, although quite small in their provision. One is the ownership. So the ownership of newspapers is a problem, because that can give one individual a large amount of influence not only over what is reported, but also how things are reported. And you know, these concerns were raised when you have people like Lebedev, who is, you know, a Russian mogul owning news outlets. So is he going to allow the newspapers to actually to tell the truth, or is he going to be pushing a certain line? Now, in the end, he chose not to, perhaps for personal reasons, perhaps because it wouldn't work in the UK. But you know, these are issues. Murdoch is another character that I mean, he's quite complicated because he does actually seem to follow audiences. It's very interesting that he has two newspapers in the UK, the Scottish Sun and the British Sun. The British, or the Sun that's pushed out in England, was it's very anti the European Union, so pro-Brexit. The Scottish Sun was the complete reverse, and basically looking to his audiences, you know, as opposed to pushing out his own line. But ownership and to what extent owners allow journalists to stick to journalistic values and not the values of the owner is something that it needs an eye keeping on that, and somebody outside of the media and government to regulate it. And I think the other thing that is not related to ownership, because of things like Rupert Murdoch, but the open partisanship, where they will blindly follow a party independent, and so just push this single line and become a propaganda arm of a party. Now, it's okay when it's balanced to some extent, you know, but we don't want to fall into a system like the US, where you have Fox on one side, CNN on the other side, and they're both just telling completely different stories, and no one is really clear about the facts and believe that their station is the only one telling the truth. So those are things that aren't huge problems in the UK at the moment, but they could be, because there is no real regulation. It's only we in the academic community, watchdogs that only really follow up after there are complaints, and there are lots of complaints, often for partisan, you know, you're not supporting my party, or you are supporting my party, you know, you're weaken your support. But those are things I think that across every country are problematic. It depends how deep the problems are. We're okay, but without any regulation, it's a problem.
Thank you so much. Okay, we don't have too much time left, so maybe Darren, it's your turn to pose maybe some questions to Ukrainian students. Maybe there is something you want to ask them, whatever.
I mean, normally under these sorts of cases, I would ask about the comparisons of news, but that would be yeah, that would be very difficult, I would say. But I mean, I suppose that the question, or the interesting question is to what extent in Ukraine is information circulating, and what information is trusted. And that's not necessarily among yourselves, perhaps, you know, but more widely in society. You know, are there certain sources on Twitter or similar social media channels that are seen as the most trustworthy, or is it certain media outlets, or do people look at media outlets and say, no, that's the state, or that is, you know, this owner? And I'm interested by that, because you know, some years ago, people would talk about a problem with media freedom in Ukraine. And of course, you know, and under current circumstances, media freedom is, you know, almost, you know, impossible. So that would be if anyone has any thoughts, or if you have any thoughts on that, Maxim.
Right now, I'm busy trying to formulate your question in a short way and check it with you whether I get it right. Okay, so do Ukrainians trust their media, and other reasons to trust Ukrainian media? What is happening with the freedom of speech?
Well, tell you what, if I word it as a simple question.
So can you repeat your last phrase? Can you repeat your last phrase?
Yeah, sorry. So I just typed. It's the briefest question.
Yeah. Okay. I will translate it. Друзі, стартуємо запитання Дарена із найпростішого питання. Які видання в Україні ви вважаєте найбільш гідними довіри? Будь ласка. Тільки давайте дуже швидко, щоб людина не почувалася, що вона розмовляє зі стіною. Okay?
Maybe it's Українська правда.
I will write the Pravda.com.ua.
Yeah. Можливо, це Суспільне. And it can be some local media that is freedom, like громадська організація, Максим Анатолійович.
NGOs, non-government organizations.
And I trust Kharkiv local media that calls Накипіло. But this media has one bad thing, that as they freedom, they very depends on grants and theme that is financial with these grants.
Okay. I may comment briefly on those. Thank you, Maria. Ukrainian Pravda is one of the oldest news Ukrainian news outlets online. It's famous for a victim of pressing on journalism is Georgy Gongadze, one of the guys being journalist society believes to be exterminated by Kuchma regime, former president, for his activity in exposing a government. This guy became one of the symbols of fledgling a news community, journalist community, trying not just being serfs of government like it was at Soviet times, but trying to be self-sufficient, self-reliant, and so on. Suspilne is a rising star right now. You see, Suspilne is one of the biggest hopes. Suspilne means suspilstvo is society. It's a Suspilne TV and Suspilne radio is Ukrainian hope to build something like our national BBC. You see, well balanced. Between the governmental support, tax money, and journalistic values. And right now, it really gives the biggest hopes because you see, its management seriously tried to heavily rely on journalistic values, journalistic standards, and maybe for years, it's been very low in ratings, but they pressed on, and now it's slowly rising, you see, because fledgling civil society and slowly starts to understand it does need serious media. Okay, Nakipela is one of the really good ones. Ukraine Now, you may Google it, is a governmental project, you know it. Union is one of the news agencies, one of the biggest, and maybe it's not that completely pro-governmental like Ukrinform, you know that, yeah. Ukrinform is just the clear voice of the government. You see, it's just state propaganda, nothing more. Whereas Union, maybe it's something more. Yeah. Babel, you know, yeah, I believe you need English here. Babel, yeah, and Zaborona. Okay.
Yeah, really interesting. And interesting reading Vladislav and Ksenia's.
Many.
I think it's very natural at times of any threat to a society that you need sources to trust, but also perhaps need to be able to trust the state in some way. I think that's absolutely normal and the sorts of things the state should be doing. But really interesting,
maybe you can comment on those entries. I mostly trust the governmental media and the media that refer to them, because now the information space is full of fakes or news. They shouldn't be spread on media at all.
And I think it's one of the biggest problems is how to know what to believe. I think that is something that's really difficult. I saw that there was a debate or something between two sides. So somebody had posted pictures of bodies in bags related to the Ukraine conflict, and then somebody had taken a picture from a film set where an actor who was waiting for the next shot was sat up in a body bag smoking, and said, this is the faked, this is the faked of what's happening, saying that what's happening in Ukraine is faked, and here is the evidence, though those two things are completely unrelated, and when but because they'd zoomed in and made it look like a shaky picture, it looked like something wrong was happening. And there's just so much of that, and not just in a situation where naturally it's hard to get information because of the conflict that's taking place, but even in American politics, these claims are made, things are faked, and it's very difficult to then prove that something is fake or prove that something is true. And yeah, that's why I think in the UK we're lucky with the BBC and the ITV Sky. There's also Channel 4 News, where they rely on their reputations, and they can't produce anything that's fake, and so they become the arbiters. They can say this is a fake, and if they see something being shared, they will expose it across the channels to say this is fake and this is where we think it came from. But if you don't have that, it's a real problem. And I think that's, that where you don't know, you have to find something you can rely on. And I think trust in media, is an important part of society. And that doesn't have to mean trust in state media. As Vladislav was saying, so some channels and Telegram programs like that, those sorts of platforms, it's something you think can be truth telling. Sorry, I'm just reading as I was follow up. Yeah, I think what a lot of fake stories do is try to frame them as fact, but they also try to appeal to people who are likely to believe them. So they say things that appear to be believable to those people who have certain beliefs or predispositions or biases. Very easy to attack immigrants in America because there's a large group of people who are biased against, have this idea of America as being white European. And so if the migrants are not white European, it's very easy to build bias against them. And so any fake story which appeals to that bias of them being criminals, etc., is believed. And the same is the case, where there are debates about who is committing war crimes or who is doing the wrong thing. If you support one side or the other side, you want to build up evidence. And you want that evidence to support your way of thinking. You don't want to have anything that challenges that way of thinking. So yeah. Yeah, I mean, I do think sometimes satire can be really interesting as well. That one of the great things about satire is that it is in a way it covers everybody. It always takes a little bit away from the more pompous and the leaders that don't like to be taken to be made fun of. Satire does that. And one of the funniest things I saw was Donald Trump getting angry about satirists, and really he then just provided a whole new area for them to satirize. So I think often you're best working with your satirists if you're a political leader. Just say, right, yeah, I'm going to accept that, and I'll take the joke and I'll make it, I'll own that joke. Joe Biden does it quite well with those who satirize him for being elderly and not knowing where he's going, and he'll do those sometimes.
Okay, we are running out of time.
Yes,
Thank
of
you,
course.
Darren. Yeah. For me, personally, it was extremely interesting and understandable. I believe it is so for most of our students who
I hope so.
cherish
I hope so.
this opportunity to communicate with you directly. Thank you so much. And
thank you
yeah,
everyone. Stay safe, and
yeah.
Let's hope we see an end to this very soon.
Yeah.
I can come and visit you in person, and we can have a beer in Kyiv.
Yeah. I all wish all of you to have the best to have the best media systems possible.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
See you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
you
you
very much.
Thank
Goodbye.
you. Bye.